Here's what no one tells you about falling in love with your co-star. When the cameras stop rolling and the set lights dim, sometimes the chemistry you created for millions of viewers becomes the very thing that destroys your real life. Elçin Sangu and Barış Arduç learned this lesson in the most public, most painful way imaginable, and what happened next rewrote everything we thought we knew about second chances. Istanbul, 2015. Two actors walk onto a television set to film what would become one of Turkey's most beloved romantic comedies. Neither of them knows that in just a few years, their professional partnership will spark rumors that captivate an entire nation, that their denial will become more famous than their confession, and that the truth about their relationship will remain one of Turkish entertainment's most closely guarded secrets. Until now. But before we unravel what really happened between Elçin and Barış, we need to understand who they were before they met, because the people they were then shaped everything that came after. Elçin Sangu wasn't always the radiant leading lady Turkey fell in love with. Growing up in Izmir, she was a girl torn between two worlds. Her family wanted her to pursue a stable career, something respectable, something safe. She studied at Mersin University, earning degrees that should have led her down a conventional path. But Elçin had secrets. She was taking acting classes in the shadows, nurturing a dream she barely dared to speak aloud. Her early career was a series of small roles, blink and you miss them moments in shows that didn't quite capture the nation's attention. For years, she was the girl in the background, the supporting character, the one casting directors would glance at and move past. Rejection became familiar. Self-doubt whispered in her ear during every audition. Yet something inside her refused to quit. That persistence, that quiet determination, would later become the foundation of everything she built, including the walls she'd construct around her heart. Now Barış Arduç had a completely different origin story, one that would seem almost impossibly romantic if it weren't completely true. Born in Switzerland to a Turkish family, he grew up between cultures, between languages, between identities. His path to acting wasn't a childhood dream. It was an awakening that came later, a sudden realization that pretending to be other people was the only way he could truly be himself. He studied sculpture before acting, which tells you something about how he sees the world. He understood that creation requires patience, that beauty emerges from careful attention, that some things cannot be rushed. When Barış entered Turkish television, he brought something different. A kind of intensity that felt European, a brooding quality that set him apart from the typical leading men of Turkish dramas. He wasn't trying to be likable. He was trying to be real. And that authenticity, that refusal to perform off camera what he performed on camera, would later make it nearly impossible for anyone to know what he truly felt about his most famous co-star. The year 2016 changed everything. The show was called Kiralık Aşk, which translates to Love for Rent, and if you believe in irony, you have to appreciate that title. The premise was simple, almost cliché. A professional woman hires a charming man to pose as her boyfriend to please her traditional family. Fake relationship becomes real feelings. Complications ensue. Standard romantic comedy formula. Except nothing about what happened was standard. From the very first table read, the crew noticed something. The way Elçin and Barış looked at each other had a weight to it, a gravity that seemed to pull everything else in the room toward them. Their chemistry wasn't the manufactured kind that actors work to create. It was effortless, organic, almost uncomfortable to witness, because it felt too intimate for a room full of strangers. The director, experienced enough to recognize lightning in a bottle, made a decision. Give them space. Let whatever this is breathe. As Kiralık Aşk began airing, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers weren't just watching a television show. They were watching what they believed to be a real romance disguised as fiction. Social media exploded with analysis, with screenshots, with slow-motion videos examining every glance, every touch, every moment where Barış's hand lingered on Elçin's shoulder just a fraction of a second longer than the script required. But here's where the story gets complicated, and here's what you need to understand about the Turkish entertainment industry. Privacy is currency. Mystery is marketing. The more the public wants to know, the more valuable the secret becomes. And Elçin and Barış, whether by design or instinct, became masters of the secret. Every interview became a carefully choreographed dance. Journalists would ask directly, "Are you together?" And they would smile, deflect, redirect. "We're just good friends. We have great professional chemistry. We care about each other deeply." Statements that confirmed nothing while denying nothing. Words chosen so precisely that both shippers and skeptics could find evidence for their beliefs. This wasn't accidental. This was strategic ambiguity elevated to an art form. As the show's popularity soared, so did the scrutiny. Paparazzi began following them everywhere. Every dinner, every coffee, every moment they were spotted together became breaking news. Fan pages dedicated to their relationship amassed hundreds of thousands of followers. People who had never met them felt personally invested in their happiness. And this is where we need to pause and ask a question that makes everyone uncomfortable. What happens to love when millions of people believe they own it? Behind the scenes, according to crew members who only spoke years later, the pressure was immense. Elçin and Barış were contractually obligated to promote the show, which meant appearances together, which meant fueling speculation, which meant their real feelings, whatever they were, became impossible to separate from their professional responsibilities. One makeup artist, speaking on condition of anonymity, described watching Elçin sitting alone in her trailer between takes, staring at her phone, scrolling through thousands of comments from strangers discussing her love life. The artist said Elçin looked trapped. Meanwhile, Barış was dealing with his own demons. Friends from his pre-fame life noticed him pulling away, becoming more guarded, less spontaneous. The man who once loved exploring Istanbul's hidden corners now couldn't walk down the street without being mobbed. And every public outing, every casual moment, was filtered through the question that followed him everywhere. What is Elçin to you? When Kiralık Aşk ended in 2017 after 2 seasons, fans assumed the truth would finally emerge. If they were really together, surely now they could admit it. If they weren't, surely they would move on to other projects, other co-stars, other lives. Neither happened. Instead, something stranger unfolded. They remained close but distant, present in each other's lives, but never quite together, at least not in any way the public could confirm. This is the moment where we need to separate what we know from what we think we know. The facts are these. Elçin and Barış never officially confirmed a romantic relationship. They were photographed together countless times in settings that seemed intimate but could be explained as friendship. They spoke about each other in interviews with genuine affection, but always maintained the language of professional respect. They never appeared at official events as a couple. They never posted couple photos on social media. By traditional metrics of celebrity relationships, nothing happened. But the rumors, the speculation, that's a different story entirely. Sources close to their inner circles, and yes, we must acknowledge these are unverified claims, suggested that something did happen during or after Kiralık Aşk. Some insiders claimed they dated secretly for months, terrified of how public confirmation would change everything. Others said they were never officially together, but shared a connection so intense it frightened them both. Still others insisted the whole thing was a brilliant publicity strategy, and they were never anything more than friends who understood their market value. What we do know with certainty is that in the years following the show, both Elçin and Barış went through visible transformations. Elçin became more selective about her projects, turning down high-profile roles that would have required her to recreate the romantic chemistry that made her famous. She started advocating for privacy, speaking publicly about the mental health toll of constant speculation. In one particularly revealing interview from 2019, she said something that stuck with everyone who heard it. She said, "When people think they know your heart better than you do, you start to doubt your own feelings." Barış, meanwhile, threw himself into work with almost manic intensity. He took on darker, more complex roles that were as far from romantic comedy as possible. He moved away from the spotlight when he could, spending time in Switzerland, reconnecting with the parts of himself that existed before fame. And in rare, unguarded moments, when asked about Elçin, his entire demeanor would shift. Not in an obvious way, but if you watched closely, you could see it. A softness in his eyes. a pause before speaking. The body language of someone choosing words carefully because the truth is too complicated to explain. Then came 2021, and the moment that reignited everything. They were both attending the same industry event, something neither could avoid without it becoming its own story. The photographers were ready, the fans were watching the live streams, and when Elçin and Barış saw each other across the room, everything stopped. Not literally, of course, but everyone who was there described it the same way. Time seemed to slow. They moved toward each other like magnets, like people who had been holding their breath and could finally exhale. The embrace lasted 7 seconds. We know this because fans literally counted. 7 seconds of two people holding each other in a room full of cameras and strangers, and in those 7 seconds, you could see everything they'd never said. Relief. Longing. Familiarity. Loss. When they pulled apart, Elçin was wiping her eyes, and Barış had his hand on her shoulder, steadying her, or maybe steadying himself. That encounter sparked a new wave of speculation, more intense than anything before. But here's what happened next, and this is where the story becomes something deeper than celebrity gossip. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. They didn't leave together. They didn't post about each other. They returned to their separate lives. And in that nothing, in that deliberate choice to not give the public what it wanted, there was a kind of answer. Because maybe, just maybe, what Elçin and Barış understood that the rest of US didn't was that some connections are too precious to perform. Maybe they learned that the moment you turn your private feelings into public property, they stop belonging to you. Maybe their love story, if that's what it was, couldn't survive in the spotlight, and they loved each other enough to let it exist in the shadows rather than watch it burn in the glare. In 2023, Barış got married to someone outside the industry, a relationship he kept almost entirely private until the wedding announcement. The news sent shockwaves through the fan communities that had spent years convinced he and Elçin were destined for each other. The betrayal some fans felt was real and raw, as if a promise had been broken, even though no promise had ever been made. Elçin's response to the news was silence, dignified and complete. She didn't congratulate him publicly. She didn't comment. She simply continued living her life, and in that silence, people heard whatever they needed to hear. But here's the detail that most people missed, the one that changes how we understand everything. 3 weeks after Barış's wedding announcement, Elçin was spotted having dinner with friends at a small restaurant in Istanbul. A fan who was there, someone who had followed the Elçin and Barış story for years, posted about it later. She said Elçin looked lighter than she had in years. Not heartbroken. Not devastated. Relieved. Free. As if a question that had been hanging over her for nearly a decade had finally been answered, and she could stop waiting for whatever she'd been waiting for. This is the part of the story where we have to confront an uncomfortable truth about how we consume celebrity relationships. We create narratives that serve our needs, not theirs. We decide what love should look like, how it should progress, when it should be declared. We treat real people like characters in a story we're writing, and when they don't follow our script, we feel cheated. But Elçin and Barış never owed us their story. They never promised us an ending. They simply lived their lives while we watched and interpreted and projected. So what really happened between them? The honest answer is we don't know, and we probably never will. Maybe they had a brief, intense romance that burned out before it could begin. Maybe they loved each other deeply but knew they wanted different lives. Maybe they were soulmates who met at the wrong time. Maybe they were just friends with extraordinary chemistry that we mistook for something else. All of these possibilities could be true. None of them might be. What we do know is this. Two talented actors created something magical on screen that touched millions of lives. They handled unprecedented public pressure with remarkable grace. They protected something between them, whether it was love or friendship or simply mutual understanding, from the consuming hunger of public curiosity. And in doing so, they taught us something valuable about boundaries, about the difference between what we're entitled to know and what we simply want to know. The love story of Elçin and Barış was rewritten not with a dramatic confession or a fairy tale wedding, but with quiet dignity, with choices that prioritize their peace over our curiosity. with the understanding that the most profound connections don't always fit neat narratives. They rewrote it by refusing to write it for us at all, by keeping the most important chapters private, by recognizing that some stories are meant to be lived, not performed. Today, both of them continue to work, to grow, to evolve beyond the roles that made them famous. Elçin has become a producer, telling stories she believes in, claiming creative control over her narrative in ways she couldn't before. Barış has found happiness in his personal life while continuing to challenge himself professionally. They exist in each other's orbit occasionally, always respectful, always warm, always maintaining that careful distance that suggests both connection and boundary. And maybe that's the real love story. Not the one where everything is declared and documented and displayed, but the one where two people care about each other enough to protect what's real from what's marketable. Maybe love isn't always about the grand gesture or the public claim. Maybe sometimes it's about knowing when to hold on and when to let go, when to speak and when silence says more. If you've watched their story unfold over the years, if you've wondered and speculated and hoped, you're not alone. Millions of us have been there with you, searching for clues, building theories, investing our emotions in their happiness. But perhaps it's time we celebrate them not for giving us the story we wanted, but for having the courage to live the story they needed. That's the real romance. That's the real happy ending. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about celebrity, privacy, and the nature of love in the public eye, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories behind the headlines. And leave a comment about a time when you had to choose between what people expected and what your heart needed. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is rewrite our own story, even when the world is watching. Elçin and Barış showed us how.